Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning to those on the West Coast or further west, and good afternoon to those joining us from the East Coast. My name is Stephanie Guillory. I may have seen some of you before on previous webinars. And I'm really excited to be here today for a conversation with Dr. Todd Rogers and Dr. Shadae Harris, where we're going to really dive into family engagement and attendance. And so you may have seen a recent study that was published in Ed Week published an article about it around how districts with stronger family engagement pre-pandemic also saw much lower rates of chronic absenteeism post-pandemic. So we thought, who better to dig in a little more to this conversation than our partner at Richmond Public Schools, Dr. Shadae Harris, who's doing a lot of amazing family engagement work over in Richmond, and one of the actual researchers from the study, our co-founder and chief scientist, Dr. Todd Rogers. So before I introduce our star guests and we hand the mic over to them, I wanted to cover a couple housekeeping items. So you may have noticed, we are recording the session and we will be sharing it out to everyone tomorrow. So in case you want to watch it again or share with a colleague who is not able to attend, that will be in your inbox tomorrow morning. And we also will be, after our conversation, we'll have some time for Q&A. So feel free as the conversation goes on, just to drop any questions you may have in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And if we don't get to all of them, don't worry, we're sharing everyone's contact information at the end, so you can drop it, you can email any questions you may have. So with that out of the way, I'm going to introduce our guests. So Dr. Shadae Harris is the Chief Engagement Officer at Richmond Public Schools. So originally hailing from Springfield, Massachusetts, she is a daughter of a community organizer and a teacher. So really that educator is in her DNA, and she's always been driven to become an educator. And so she served as a fourth grade teacher as well as a principal in her hometown, and then moved on to pursue her master's and doctorate at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And so throughout her time, now that she's now a chief engagement officer leading the conversation around attendance, she's always been driven by a passion for advocating on behalf of families and students of color. And right now, she is really a leader in that conversation around how we think about chronic absenteeism through a true engagement approach. So welcome, Dr. Shadae Harris. We are also joined by Dr. Todd Rogers. He is a behavioral scientist and professor at Harvard, and he is also our co-founder and chief scientist here at Everyday Labs. He is, you may have known, our proven effective everyday intervention is informed by his seminal research, and you can learn more about that research on our website. And he also just published the fantastic book, Writing for Busy Readers. So we're all, that's right, right in the background. We're all busy readers in our modern world. And so these best practices and tips can also really help your family school communications as you make sure your message comes across to an audience that, they have more on their plate than ever before. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Shadae Harris and Dr. Todd Rogers.
Thank you, Stephanie. Shadae, it's amazing to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you. I'm going to start by just giving a little bit of background about the research that Stephanie was alluding to a moment ago. So Karen Mapp, who is a friend and mentor of Shadae and me, and an advisor to Everyday Labs. She and I worked with several organizations, including Learning Heroes and the New Teacher Project, to engage in a research project. I'm going to spend 2 minutes. For those of you who are already bored by the tone of my voice, it's going to be 2 total minutes on this. A research project on how, because we heard as we talked to all these schools and school district leaders and teachers, that the schools that had great family relationships before the pandemic showed much smaller negative consequences post-pandemic on attendance and academic performance than those that had poor family relationships. And so what we did was we found there's this incredible data set out of Illinois called the 5 Essentials, where they measure every school in Illinois on these 5 attributes. One of them is involved families, which is a measure that essentially the extent to which all school staff develop strong relationships with families. And it's based on survey responses of parent influence on decision-making, parent involvement in schools, and teacher-parent trust. And so from there, we found we could identify schools that have the same academic performance and same demographic attributes, but just differ on this strength of family involvement. And then we look at what happened before the pandemic versus after, because we're seeing this spike in absenteeism. And as we predicted, and you would not be surprised if you're in the family engagement space, everybody showed this increase district, like nationally, Virginia, and in this case, Illinois, and I live in Massachusetts. Everyone is seeing a spike in chronic absenteeism. But that spike is much smaller, by about 39%, when schools had stronger family relationships before the pandemic, leading into where we are now. And so basically what we interpret that as one more dimension of benefit of investing in relationships with families, which is it's a buffer against unexpected disasters or unexpected events that disrupt. That's the word, disruption. Unanticipated disruptions. It's another buffer. There are all these known benefits that all Shadae and I and Karen and others and Everyday Labs are all focused on, which is all these academic and attendance benefits to kids and families of strengthening the connection between families and schools with a focus on learning, on the kids learning. But it turns out it also is a buffer against disruption. That's it. That's the new research. If you want it, we'll send out. In fact, Stephanie, if you can find the report, if you could send it out over the chat or the Ed Week article or one of the Washington Post articles or something about this report, we'll send it out. It's great. We're excited about it. It's exactly what we expected. There's all these downstream benefits of investing in this relationship. And that is why we want to bring a real expert in practice of actually building family school partnerships focused on student success, and who has been seeing incredible results. And that is where my friend, Dr. Shadae Harris, thank you for joining. I have no reason to show a huge blank slide that says Q&A. I'm just gonna I'm gonna unpresent and we'll just focus on us. Thanks for joining, Shadae.
Thank you for having me.
You've reduced chronic absenteeism in your division by 15% so far this year. What would you say are the key practices that have contributed to this improvement?
Thank you. So I would say the first major shift has been just the reframing of attendance from an engagement lens, right? So as soon as you do that, you just move different. Like even the way we're set up, attendance lives with me as a chief engagement officer. We have a chief engagement officer, right? Like this is like something built into the system. So if you say like engagement has to be linked to learning, where it's situated in the system is really important. So family engagement is like one of our key priorities in our strategic plan. But the way that we really tie it to link to learning is that your first goal under engagement is decreasing chronic absenteeism. So really saying that, you know what, in order to move this work, it's going to be about listening to families and supporting families with the barriers that are getting in the way of positive attendance. That really set us up for success in a completely different way. From there, we're then able to say like, okay, how do we then build capacity, both in the community as well as in our school system, so our schools really understand how we're moving away from truancy and moving more to chronic absenteeism, looking at both unexcused, excused, suspensions, anything that impacts, academic achievement. So that has been really powerful, is like you mentioned Karen Mapp, but her dual capacity framework does that. It says you have to do both things. means building that family capacity as well as school capacity. So really investing in the professional learning and the resources that allow leaders and teachers to quickly, the mindset shift is first, but then having those really clear data tools that will allow you to make those real-time decisions about what supports families need. But more importantly, you won't get that unless you're communicating on a regular basis. So increasing our tools on how to do that, so it's true partnership, has really, really, really made a difference. And I would say the last thing is, there are all different types of root causes we know that can impact attendance, and really paying attention to the context and the history of wherever you're situated is super important. So starting from this place of honoring history, for me, that was Richmond, and understanding the assets of the community I'm in, but also what are some of the struggles. For us, housing was a major struggle. So being able to, one, honor the history, understand some of the root causes, and make sure our strategy is aligned to that. Those have all been things that helped us really accelerate our growth.
So much in there. I want to ask more on all of it. I followed what you were saying through the like you're starting with, it starts org chart, and you're like, you're at the senior levels of the district. They're like, look, engagement is a central is essential. But then you're like, we need to link engagement to outcomes and student success, and tie it so that the entire mission of the school thinks of itself as about engagement. Am I parroting that back first? So that ends up being, like you were describing, that as mindset.
Yeah.
That's district, like leadership wide. Like engagement is not an add-on. It's part of the thing.
Yeah.
And then yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I'm just parroting back, because I was taking rapid notes that are completely illegible and crossed out. So then you start talking about tools, context, and practices.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm like, I was asking you a very broad question, but I guess we'll get into those in a second. But before we get there, like, so how do you measure success? Right? When you think about you've done all these from the high level down to the context and practice of, how do you measure success?
Absolutely. So I know we have a lot of people in the chat, and you can put a thumbs up if you've ever been in a situation where, you see different pockets of success, you see different things, but it's very much like a system of different schools. We noticed that, and what we really realized in reflection is, if we're going to be a school system where we see that consistency and uniformity across the division, these weren't just like a school specific practice, it had to be division-wide engagement goals. So the first thing is making sure that as a division, we set our goal, and then the expectations around engagement, like we have a guidebook for school leaders with what is your engagement plan for the year. And everyone had those 3 goals: decrease chronic absenteeism, improve family and community, to improve school family communication, 2-way, it has to be bi-directional, and then increase parent advocacy, right? So everybody—
wait, that's district-wide.
District-wide, and then the strategies are differentiated by school and by community, right? I could be a school that has no PTO, PTA, school council, someone else is raising $50,000 a year, right? So noticing those differences, how do we then tailor the strategies to that school community? So again, getting to a school system, it starts with that, like, what are the expectations, and then how are we going to hold them accountable? So when you talk about measure success, everyone's setting that goal for one, which is decrease chronic absenteeism. So that's the first thing. Now we utilize our everyday pro tracker, our school-based trackers of how are you seeing growth and success towards that goal. So that is kind of a major shift for us. Having those plans like before school starts, like having that clarity, and then using our team to really help and refine strategies. The other way that we measure it is really looking at how we're tracking engagement, right? We've been able to make some kind of causal assumptions and see some really huge impact or correlation between attendance and chronic absentee attendance and engagement because we track engagement. So we have an engagement dashboard. So anytime liaisons are making outreach, doing home visits, I can tell you right now, y'all, we've done 12,256, engagement outreach attempts because I have it all on the tracker. I can break it down by success. I can break it down by comments. What were the barriers that were discussed? And everybody is working from one place. So my social worker isn't calling the same family as my liaison, as the principal, but that was one thing we had to say. If we're serious about this should be the same state of the art tracker that we have for literacy in terms of how are we measuring and tracking our engagement. So I think using those tools like the Everyday Pro dashboard, our school trackers, and then our engagement dashboard has really allowed us to just measure in a more incremental way. Because if you're setting a goal for the end of the year, no one is saying like, look, next year I want to be X. Like we need it like 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So our families, our leaders our teachers could experience success. And then these tools and having those systems really allowed us to do that. And that built momentum, especially being in a division where the data looked so stark. We were almost at 40%, like pandemic, after the pandemic, like we needed a win, y'all. And being able to really implement a stronger data system where those school-based attendance teams could like build that momentum, experience success, that's what really helped us move.
Can I wait? So when you started that by talking about these 3 initial goals, chronic absenteeism, family involvement, 2-way. I remember going back and what you were saying, and then what was the third?
Increased parent advocacy.
Is that those are like the district level goals for so like it's not ELA scores, which so I just want to like tease that apart. We often set goals. This is not the point of the panel, but we often set goals that are outcomes, and we don't really have control over outcomes. We have control over inputs and processes and the things that we have agency over. You have much more influence over attendance than you do math scores, right? Because there are all these tactics and tools that you can use to improve attendance. Whereas if you just set the sort of the outcome as the goal without what would you call them? Scaffolding, it ends up being, so that leads to the next question that you and I talked about. What initiatives have you used to actually start to move that goal, that outcome, which is chronic absenteeism? And the way that I'm sorry, I'm on this. Hetty Chang and I have sort of like spent a bunch of time talking about, originally we talked about chronic absenteeism as a consequence of like school, things going on in school. It's something we need to work on. Yeah, excuse me, as an input into academic performance. It's also, it is both a predictor and a consequence of things of student success. And so we sort of like, absenteeism is both a measure that we want to work on, but it's also an input into student success. I'm completely unhelpfully how do you measure that success? How do you what initiatives have you been trying this year?
Yeah, I think the first thing is like at heart, like I'm a storyteller. And when you are working in communities, when you're thinking about like, communicating for busy readers, right? Like it's all about like, what story are you telling? And when you change that mindset from an attendance or more of a truancy punitive lens to engagement, the story that we were telling was really that like, look, we love you here. And that is a much stronger way to build relationships and trust with families, especially in systems where trust has been broken generationally, right? So you have to acknowledge like we have some harm to repair. And the first part of repairing harm is truth, right? So we have to acknowledge that these systems have been broken and that we love you here. So that was the slogan I came up with, and we developed a multi-year campaign. We had videos, we had t-shirts. I'm going to send you a t-shirt, Todd. It was just like, we love you here. So one of those strategies is, what messaging are you using to combat some of the harm that has been done in your community? You need something for people to wrap around. So one, launching the We Love You Here campaign allowed us to continue down that road about changing mindsets, and really to emphasize both for students and families, like, we have some work to do, but we want your trust and we want you here. I think secondly is really thinking about and reframing this role of like an attendance officer. That is something that did not work in the past. And again, I'm not opening the door for an attendance officer, right? It was just not aligned with our reframed way about building relationships. So what we did is really revamp those roles so that they were family liaisons and that they reflected the brilliance and beauty of our students and families. So we hired more people of color. In Richmond City, predominantly our students are Black and Brown. We have a growing multilingual population, predominantly Spanish, but we weren't reflective of that, right? So again, if it's about building relationships, I need to show you that you need to see yourself in the person who's building relationships too. So that allowed us, is recrafting that job description, allowed us, one, to prioritize hiring more people who reflected our community, who could build those relationships, but also who already had credibility in the community. We don't have to reinvent the wheel a lot of times. Is that what policies may be preventing us from getting the right people in these roles? One of them for our end was the education requirement, right? That was keeping a lot of people out. We reworked that. So I have people on the team as a liaison who has a master's in social work, and someone else that doesn't have traditional education, but they have way more credibility in the community than me, than anybody, right? So really thinking about those policies that serve as barriers to building those relationships allowed us to kind of, again, run much faster. And then also, I have to tell you, like the everyday labs, the nudges, that clarity around information, we heard from our families. I think to date, we have over like 9,000 responses, and our opt-out rate is 1%. And I have other things where it's a much higher opt-out rate. So our families like really enjoy it, but what it did was like, okay, if you're about communication, we just didn't have the tools that would allow us to do it on a regular basis, right? We didn't have the capacity around sending out those nudges, like, and cycles to people who are approaching chronic absenteeism or showing 5%. We needed that capacity as a division. So those tools, the nudges, Everyday Pro, also just like built our own capacity on how we can just like move quicker and make those decisions in real time, especially in terms of like two-way communication with our families to get them the resources that they need. Those two things have just been a game changer. Right now, we're at like 20%, and we just had a huge break. This time last year, it was like upwards of like 35. And we're seeing that because we're able to use these tools in a way that is really about the relationship. But we're investing time when our teachers and our leaders on how do you use the tools? You have 45 minutes, right? Like, what does that 45 minutes look like with Pro? What does it look like in looking at your data? But you have to invest the same amount of time on the school end as well as the community end.
As always, so much in there, and wisdom. Lead with love. I remember that was the story in the Richmond Times where they quoted you. They're like, and from the start of our conversation just now, it's like, mindset is engagement is central. Lead with love. I love it. What are some myths about family engagement you wish you could bust?
Biggest myth is that families do not have the expertise or brilliance that adds to the conversation, that adds to whatever strategy you're trying to implement. that adds to where we're trying to get to with, educational success in college, career, beyond. I think the biggest myth is that families are not bringing anything that is extremely valuable that will get you there. And if you don't believe that, that's why, family engagement is not embedded in the plan, because we don't believe it's actually going to lead to the outcome. We just see it as an outcome, not as a strategy that's going to allow us to get there. And that goes deeper into what you think about your families, right? So we really have to bust that myth of especially in communities in color, the resilience, just the I'm getting excited, right? In Richmond, we come from, the first thing I think about is Maggie Walker, who was the first Black president of a bank, female, right? All those things, that greatness, and really understanding the brilliance that our communities come, and not leading from that deficit and, looking at the crime here or something like that. But that if you go from a deficit base, you're going to miss the value that no one else can bring but that child's family or caregiver. And you actually need that in order to run. And once you have it and respect it and honor it, you will meet all your goals.
Nice. I heard in that answer the dual capacity framework and an asset-based approach to families. You mentioned it earlier. Can you just, since we're coming to the end, let's help. Can you help explain dual capacity framework, and what is it even like? How does that connect all this?
So when I came to Richmond, there was no office of engagement, and the dual capacity framework is the blueprint, right? So it basically kind of set us up for, we know that there are challenges that exist between educators and families, but we also know that there are certain process conditions and organizational conditions that if you have those in place, that's going to lead to strong partnerships between schools and families. Some of the ones that we've talked about on this call today are, you're starting with building relationships, right? You have to build that trust. From an organizational standpoint, it needs to be embedded in a system. You actually have to have the data tracking. You have to measure and be able to quantify the growth and the progress that you're making. So it really lays out both process conditions and organizational conditions, and it kind of leads you through till you get to the strong partnerships. I would highly recommend that you all look at that, but I think Richmond is a good example of what does that look like in action in terms of building the system, starting at, no, engagement has to have a seat at the table, because I wouldn't have been able to reframe attendance if I didn't have a seat at the table. I'll be honest with you, right? It has to be built into the larger system of academics. Someone asked me, how do I do this work when I have such a small engagement budget? And I was like, you're working from the wrong budget. My budget is the academic budget, right? If engagement is truly a strategy to improve academic, if it's linked to learning, you are at that table thinking about, how are we going to utilize and leverage the brilliance and the experience of our families that they have about our students for us to decrease chronic absenteeism, to improve literacy? So I would say those things are really, really, really important.
Amazing. Like every time we talk, I wish we had hours, certainly more than the 30 minutes. We are now somehow already at time. I'm going to throw it to Stephanie, but first, Shadae, thank you for the work you're doing and for joining me and everybody here.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you. I got to shout out Emily, one of my coaches. And just again, when you have to move fast, having tools like the pro, the support, but also those nudges, game changer, has really allowed us to accelerate and just reach more families. So I just wanted to thank you guys as well.
Thank you so much, Shadae and Todd. It was a great conversation. So we had a bunch of questions around the dashboards that you're using, and then also your strategic plan. And so maybe we can talk about what kind of stuff we could share in our follow-up. But in the meantime, if you have any questions at all for Dr. Rogers or Dr. Harris, reach out here. You can also reach out to us directly if you would like to learn more about improving attendance and family engagement with Everyday Intervention and Everyday Pro. I think my colleague, Dr. Nicole Bosworth, will be dropping in her contact info as well as our form in case you want to learn more information. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year, and that you'll tune in for our webinars in the new year. So thank you all. And I'll drop in our web form as well in there. Perfect. Well, I think we are at the end of our time. It always goes by very fast, nice and action-packed. So thank you all and see you soon. Bye.